Eugenie Sage.
E te manga o te whare tēnā koe, tuarua ki ngā mema o tō tātou whare, tēnā koutou katoa. The Green Party is pleased to be supporting the Wildlife Powers Amendment Bill. We want to see the Department of Conservation staff and fish and game officers better able to stop the smuggling of distinctive wildlife, such as our native geckos, because we know that they are being illegally smuggled out of New Zealand, and there is a very real problem. Department of Conservation staff told the Select Committee that very few green geckos have been legally exported from New Zealand, but the supposedly captive bred population in Europe is actually much larger than the breeding capability of those legally exported geckos. So they're obviously being smuggled out of New Zealand without being apprehended. And very low levels of take can significantly impact on species like the green gecko and the forest gecko and others, because some of these species don't breed until they're 8 years old, and then they've only got a maximum of 2 offspring each year. And those offspring are very vulnerable to predators like cats. So they're very slow to recover from losses from smuggling. So we certainly want the loopholes in the Wildlife Act, which has made it more difficult for Department of Conservation staff to take action against smugglers, closed, and to investigate offences, because the Act 1953 is more than 60 years old, and these enforcement powers haven't been updated during that time. But, Mr Chair, if the Parliament is amending the Wildlife Act, and this is the second time we have considered changes around the offence provisions, the last time, of course, was with a private member's bill by Jackie Dean, which increased the penalties, then it's time to actually look at a much larger modernisation of the 60-year-old Act. And I think it reflects the government's lack of ambition that we haven't had that much wider modernisation. There hasn't been the effort through this bill to actually provide the same protection for our native fish species that we do through the Act for our Indigenous birds. Because it's this, the Wildlife Act, which provides protection for our native birds from being kept in captivity. You can't kill any native bird except the pukeko, the sooty shearwater or the titi, and the paradise shelduck, because of provisions in the Wildlife Act. Yet there is no protection in the Wildlife Act for any of our native freshwater fish species. And despite the hugely precarious position of a lot of those native fish. 74% of our native fish species are facing extinction. That's a much higher proportion than virtually any country in the world. And 31 of our 66 freshwater fish species are only found in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So if they go extinct here, they go extinct on the whole planet. Yet the schedules to the Wildlife Act don't include any protection for native fish. We protect lizards, we protect our native bats, we protect Pauelephantus snail and a few other species of snail. We protect them from being killed, from being hunted, from being traded and being held captive without proper authorisation. The freshwater fish regulations provide legal protection for introduced species such as trout and the Chinook salmon, but they don't provide any protection for native fish species. So, Minister, would be very interested as to whether you would take a call on making sure that the Wildlife Act is amended to actually provide protection for some of our most vulnerable native species, our freshwater fish. And there's been a major increase in the risk of extinction for those native fish species. Back in 1990, the Department of Conservation recorded only 10 of our 66 native fish species, and 10 was too many, to be threatened with extinction. By 2002, that had increased to 16, and 2013, 74% of our native fish species are threatened or at risk of extinction. And, Mr Chair, that includes 4 of the 5 species that New Zealanders eat as whitebait patties. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of the fact that the koaro, the short-jawed kokapu, the giant kokapu and the inanga are all at risk of extinction, yet it is their young that are fished and killed as whitebait, Mr Chair.
Eugenie Sage.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and that end up in whitebait patties. I think we need a serious national conversation about the fate of whitebait and whether we should be having a moratorium on whitebait fishing to give a better chance for species like the koaro and the giant kokapoo to survive. I've been out at night on the west coast looking at just a small creek through an area that had been disturbed, and there were giant kokapoo there. They were amazing. The fish we saw was as big as my hand, and yet it's the young of these species that are being killed as whitebait. So we shouldn't have a double standard in the Wildlife Act where our native birds are recognised as taonga, where they are protected from being hunted and killed, and yet our native freshwater fish enjoy no such similar protection, and they can be hunted and killed despite the fact that many of them are staring extinction in the face. So would be very grateful if the Minister in the Chair could comment on whether she and her department, in the remaining time available to this government, propose to bring a much more comprehensive change to the Wildlife Act to actually provide protection for native fish species. Because it is ridiculous that these fish can be caught and then commercially sold without any regulation. You cannot commercially sell trout for very good reason, yet you can commercially sell whitebait. Why? Why has the government failed to close this glaring loophole when these species are so vulnerable and when they're threatened with extinction? We need to improve their prospects, and we can do that by amending the Wildlife Act to actually give them protection by having the Department of Conservation establish some freshwater fish reserves, and by looking very closely at more of the irrigation schemes, the intensive agriculture that is actually destroying their habitat, as is happening with Ruataniwha. So the bill is a good one in providing a stronger enforcement powers and allowing Department of Conservation staff to actually investigate these offences in a better way. We in the Green Party will be supporting the Honourable David Parker's SOP because fish and game officers go through, the honorary officers go through exactly the same training as the warranted officers. Fish and Game has got statutory powers, so it's not just a non-government organisation in the same way that Forest and Bird is. And they have a lot of officers around the country who are doing this work to implement the Act, and they do need that power to actually ask people for their date of birth in order to ensure that any prosecutions that are taken can actually stick. So I encourage the Minister to comment on why the government is failing to support this sensible amendment to the Act, and whether there is a proposed much more significant change to the Wildlife Act to actually provide much needed protection for our native fish species which are staring extinction in the face. Thank you.